on today's special edition of World Insight with Tian Wei.
中非友好大家庭的新老朋友们再次相聚。
Win-win cooperation. China and Africa have together figured out their own way. Let's investigate the plan. And 1 week after his inauguration, Zimbabwean President Emerson Mnangagwa already in Beijing and in an exclusive interview with us about his options ahead.
The world is not one basket. There are so many baskets in terms of international economic environment.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me. This is our special program on the Forum of China-Africa Cooperation. I'm Tian Wei. The 2018 summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation has drawn to a close in Beijing on Tuesday with a declaration on building a community with a shared future. The forum has also approved action plan for cooperation between China and the African continent over the next 3 years. Before we get down to business, let's take a look at this.
South-South cooperation at its best. Chinese President Xi Jinping gave a joint press conference with Cyril Ramaphosa, South African President and the next co-chair of the forum, to unveil the results of the summit.
We agreed that China-Africa relations have stood the test of time in international changes. They have embarked on a distinctive path of win-win cooperation. China-Africa relations are at their best in history.
The summit issued the Beijing Declaration toward building a stronger China-Africa community. Earlier on Tuesday, leaders from both sides offered a roadmap for where China-Africa relations will be heading in 2019 to 2021. At the summit, President Xi unveiled the 8 initiatives that will take place over the next 3 years and beyond on the basis of the 10 cooperation plans already adopted at the last FOCAC summit in 2015 in Johannesburg. These initiatives extend to the fields of industrial acceleration, infrastructure connectivity, trade facilitation, green development, capacity building, healthcare, people-to-people exchanges, and peace and security. China will extend $60 billion of financing to Africa, provided in the form of government assistance, as well as investments and loans by financial institutions and companies. China also aims to align the Belt and Road Initiative with the African Union's Agenda 2063 and the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. China has been the African region's largest trading partner for 9 consecutive years, and the march of win-win cooperation is not slowing down.
And for more on the Forum of China-Africa Cooperation, we have in our Beijing studio Professor He Wenping, who is the director from the African Studies Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Welcome back to our program. Also joining us in Beijing from Africa, Hannah Ryder, CEO of Development Reimagined. Welcome back as well.
Pleasure to be here.
And joining us in Nairobi, Kenya, we have Professor Mwenda Kilemi from the University of Nairobi. Good to see you, Professor. Let me start by asking you, Professor, very briefly, if you can, for the very first question. $60 billion cooperation between China and Africa in almost every field. What does that tell us about this action plan? Professor? Professor Kilemi?
Yes? Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me on your show. What we're seeing now is an increase in investment in Africa. And what China is doing is leading other nations to also follow up and try to do the same thing with us. But it was China who did it first, because China understands what Africa is going through and because they were there themselves. So we talk about a China-Africa relationship is because China has been through what Africa is going through right now. So they understand the kind of development that we need to do. And through the kind of investments that we are seeing happening the last few days, we are sure that China will continue to show the path for Africa in a win-win situation where the African continent can hopefully one day reach the level where China is right now.
I see. Shared, in a way, mentality common mentality in a way. That's what Professor is trying to emphasize here. But Rana, help me to understand 60 billion US dollars. Once again, almost every field. This is amazing in a way.
It is really a good start, and it's very important. Actually, the African continent needs at least 68 billion of external financing going forward. These are the estimates.
I can't.
Plus, they also need 20 to 30 billion of financing just for climate change issues. So the fact that China has maintained its contribution from the last Forum on China-Africa Cooperation is really important and very, very good signal. And also, given that prior to the summit, there's been a lot of negative press suggesting that Africa is in a great deal of external debt problems. Well, that might be the case for certain countries. They might have some challenges, but the fact is, in order to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, in order to pull people out of poverty in the continent, we need more finance, not less.
Well, Professor He, one of the things from the chairman of the African Development Bank is it is rumor, and it is not true, that Africa as a whole have been in deep debt as a result of its development agenda, including its development agenda and cooperation with China. Having said that, though, why is China putting that huge amount of money, 60 billion US dollars, into Africa? This is not just about providing aid. This is about win-win situation. This is also about what is in the declaration, which is about shared responsibilities.
Yeah, why we put that much? Of course, we saw this continent as a very potential and developing continent. It's not saying this is a continent with problem. This is a continent with chances. So otherwise, those Chinese companies won't go there, even have facing a quite high risky. But they still go there. So this is a market driven, by the way. And also, I think when we compare those 60 billion, US dollar compared with 3 years ago, that's also the same amount of money. But even though the same amount of money, but when you look break down all those money, different function, you will see also quite a lot of differences. For example, this time around, 10 billion this US dollar will call upon those Chinese companies to go to Africa to do investment.
To encourage them.
Yes, this is coming from those companies themselves, rather than coming from those Chinese Ministry of Finance. And also another, like I think it's $20 billion will goes to development finance. This finance is just particularly to address that issue you just mentioned, this so-called debt trap. Because even though China is not the main debtor to Africa, but we still now want to take some measures to deal with this issue. For example, you cannot just cut those financial providing to African countries, just like my colleague Hannah mentioned. Africa needs a lot. Not only the 60 billion, they need even 3 times more, those 60 billion.
Well, you talk about some of the factors. One is more multiple players coming into play, right? You got the private sector, you also got the government. And the other thing is different money are going to different directions. It is not just putting into one project or two, but rather they have different functions. That's a very interesting development. Having said that, though, we see there are other correlations about the plan. BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, which is an initiative 5 years ago, but in the making, together with 2030 SDG, Sustainable Development Goal of the United Nations, and also 2063, the African Union Development Goals. How will these really interact has a lot to do with the next 3 years. These forum is only being held every 3 years. So we are saying, let's just do it in the next 3 years to see whether we are having the real results.
Sure, and it's important to note that before FOCAC, only 11 or 12 African countries had formally signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative. So we're seeing more African countries, especially through the bilateral conversations, also having signed up. And the aspiration and that hope is that those countries that have signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative, that they will be getting more incentives, more support from, especially for investment to come into African countries from the Chinese investors. We work constantly trying to survey with Chinese companies, trying to encourage them to go to African countries. A lot of them don't know much about Africa. So this is also why Actually, even though foreign direct investment from China at the moment is around $40 billion, President Xi announced that we should have 10 billion more. Hopefully there'll be even more than 10 billion.
Well,
Chinese
the money should always be more, quote unquote, but the question is how to use the money smartly and use the money responsibly so that everybody will be a win-win power and win-win partner in this process. Having said that though, Professor He, let me ask you about this. Earlier, Professor Kilemi mentioned about China's effort and huge interests in exploring the opportunities together with Africa has in a way woken up the world about its curiosity and about its own thinking and development plan with Africa. Professor He, right before the FOCAC meeting, you see the British Prime Minister, really quite some years for the very first time visiting African continent. That really says something. You also heard over the days, if I remember right, that the American tech companies are going against the Chinese companies in the African market. So these are good signs because as a result, Africa has become the focal point once again, finally, of the world. Professor.
Yeah, of course, because given the China's size, given China's now becoming the second biggest economy and also the biggest developing country, of course, whenever and wherever China moves, that will cause a lot of attention from international society, particularly from those former colonizer and also those superpower like the United States, because frankly speaking, like a European continent, they still regarded Africa as their own backyard. Like South America has been regarded as the backyard for the United States. So they think now you're moving in, you have been engaged with Africa closer and closer. Of course, they have a kind of, not that so happy about this situation. So I think, which is good, because Africa has been long time forgotten by them. But now with China's engagement with Africa, and then they have also follow suit. Now they also eager to have a summit with Africa. So we have seen United States had a U.S. summit just before former President Obama left the office. Before they have never done that, and we're also seeing even emerging countries, India have summit with Africa, even Turkey with summit with Africa, even Vietnam has summit with Africa, and not mention EU. Also, like you just mentioned, Prime Minister British also came over.
That's right.
To visit.
Professor Kilemi, if you think about all this list, actually the list could go on. And it's not China's job to waken up everybody about the potential of Africa, because the African continent, they're doing very well. They are trying to make sure there's more political stability. They are working on technology. They are trying to leapfrog. They are working on their own youth. So these are the things that the African continent has been, as a whole, striving hard in order to achieve. But having said that, Professor Kilemi, if you think about African continent, it's not just as one. North Africa, South Africa, Eastern Africa, Western Africa, very different. Culture, history, and how people think, how they interact with technology. Professor Kilemi, as a result of this, how are we going to also, within African countries yourself, make sure it is a balanced development with all of these good news?
Thank you. To add to just what your colleagues have said, one of the biggest things that I got out of the meeting was a $5 billion investment in green technology. Africa is prime for green technology. We have the environment for it. We have the sun, we have the wind, we have the water. One of the biggest projects, solar projects in the world is going to happen in Egypt thanks to Chinese investment. So I'm happy to see that this is the kind of direction we're going. It's also important to note that a lot of Western criticism of Chinese involvement in Africa is not actually meant to be targeted at Africans, but to their own constituents, because they're trying to paint an image of what is going on that may not actually be the case. If you talk to most Africans, 63% of us believe that this is a good relationship that we're having. And the fact that China is hands-off and listens to Africans and asks them, what do you want? How can we help you? Is very, very important. And so I think moving forward, the best way to look at it is that Africa is a huge continent, as you talked about, and there are different needs for different areas. And we are happy that the Chinese go to each individual area and ask them what do they need and fit their demands with their supply. And that is the only way we can move forward. If you look at Kenya, the investments that have been done here are what the Kenyans wanted. And it is up to us to decide the direction we need to go. And that is the only way that this will work out for benefit for both the Chinese and the Africans.
Beautifully put, I have to say, Professor. Having said that, though, earlier we were having an exclusive interview with the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Guterres, and he was talking about leadership. He said one of the most important qualities of leadership is to have listening ears, to have listening capabilities. Professor, it seems that you have just mentioned that China and Africa, when interacting together, both sides have listening ears. And then there's a result of this. Chinese President Xi Jinping expressed at the summit this time that China follows a 5-no approach in its relations with Africa. Let's take a look at what exactly he meant. No interference in African countries' pursuit of development paths that fit their own national conditions. No interference in their internal affairs, no imposition of China's will on them, no attachment of political strings to assistance, and no seeking of selfish political gains in investment and financing cooperation. Well, Ms. Ryder, I'm sure the Chinese president is saying this also to the domestic constituency,
sure,
but to the international one as well.
Yeah.
Not only about the doubts people express about China's so-called ego toward Africa cooperation, but rather telling the rest of the world what we are working on and why we are working on cooperation with Africa.
Yeah. No, I think it's very important, and I think that setting out those principles was very useful as a framework. At the same time, what's also needed now is actually for the African leaders to go home and to start to plan their engagement more clearly with China. I think what we've seen is that, you know, a lot of the African leaders are here because of their bilateral relationship. They're here to cement that bilateral relationship, make new deals and so on.
Unprecedented scale
Sure,
this time.
exactly.
Oh my God,
That's
if
right.
you look at the number of countries
That's
present
right.
here today.
Yes, yes. At the same time, many African countries still do not have a clear plan for engagement with China. Certainly not ones that they're public or aware of. And it's also, for example, take Kenya, we have a very large trade deficit with China. Rwanda also has a large trade deficit with China, 30-1. So these issues can only be tackled by being proactive and being proactive about the relationship. This is an opportunity, but in order for it to be even more win-win, African countries also need to take hold of that relationship as well.
Professor He, that's a good point. On the other hand, if you look at the African continent as a whole, China is having certain kinds of trade surplus against certain countries, including some of the examples Ms. Ryder just mentioned, but also trade deficit against some of the other African economies. So how will China look at this balance? You know, in a way, with some countries, but not with other countries. Overall, China is the largest trading partner of the African continent as a whole. So, Professor, how is that likely to be balanced by China?
Yeah, this differences is because Africa has different situations.
Exactly.
Some are rich resources countries, some are less, poor resources country, and so that's why those trade deficit normally goes to those, poor resources country. So trade surplus, of course, goes to those rich resources country. But now things goes another way around, because after this raw material prices coming down in the past years, all those rich resources country, for example, Angola, for example, Nigeria, so their economic situation is not as good as before. So their economic GDP growth rate also is coming down dramatically.
They have to look for their own diversity of economic development,
Right.
including how that is working with cooperation with China.
Exactly.
That is a great point you just made. Ms. Kilemi, we talk so much about different aspects of this cooperation. But one of the things is a big concept, the so-called shared community of shared future between China and Africa. Of course, that's an abstract phrase, but it seems that there are some kinds of underlined determination between the two sides, China and African countries, about what great potential they're trying to see in each other, what kinds of comprehensive partnerships for the longer term they are looking at each other. Professor.
To just add on to something that your colleague mentioned earlier, I think it's important that the world stops infantilizing African leadership and stop being patriotical with the way we view African leadership. We need to appreciate that African leaders know what's best for Africa. And so this idea that people can determine how in a way you should develop, it won't work. It's never worked and it won't work anymore. What we need is a partner like China who tells us, what do you want, and helps us, facilitates us to get what we want. We have a common shared goal because we have a common history. Africa is impoverished. China was impoverished. And so they can show us the way forward. As we look forward, globalization is having its own fights here and there. We can have an alternate globalization system where the Chinese work with the Africans. There's so much potential in Africa from manufacturing to production. If Americans are not willing to provide what China wants, why not do it here in Africa, where we can farm, where we can produce, where we can manufacture at cheaper prices than they can be done in the West?
Great point. I remember reading the latest article written by Bill Gates talking about China-Africa cooperation potential because he and his foundation has been paying close attention to the development issues. He talked about 2 points. One is about agriculture cooperation. The other is about health cooperation. Both are essential for developing and emerging economies. Ms. Ryder, what about how these related to the overall big concept, shared future community in a way? Big ego, big potential, but how to implement step by step.
Yeah. Well, we also have to recognize that both China and African countries are going through massive transformation right now.
Absolutely.
And a complementary transformation. So from China's transforming from an economy which is very manufacturing based, moving into a consumption and service-based economy, while African countries are trying to industrialize in a green way as well, which has never been done in the world before.
And might leapfrog as a result.
Right. This is the
This is the key, isn't it?
So many innovations coming out from African countries. So there is a potential for some real complementarity, but the devil is in the detail. How do we do it together?
Right. And how every government back at home needs to figure out their own development plan and how the cooperation with China will fit into that development plan. I guess this is a test for everybody, including for Beijing as well. Before we go, only 30 seconds left for you, Professor He. Your final thought.
Yeah, I think that's the key words you said. There's a targeting integration. Maybe I translated it into English like that. Because it's not one size fits all. This One Belt, One Road initiative goes to Africa. So we have to fit them exactly with those development priority coming from different African countries. Yeah, otherwise you won't see good results maybe years later.
Understanding the diversity and work with the diversity, always with opening ears.
Right,
that is the key, isn't it?
Yes.
Thank you so much, He Wenping from China, Hannah Ryder, and Mwanda Kilemi. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, still to come on our program.